Hi everybody. Sorry, we were facing some glitches, so the session took slightly longer to start. We've changed the format a little bit. I'll briefly talk about corridors in this talk, and I'll give you a small slideshow as well about a few things regarding connectivity, especially with respect to tigers, since it's Global Tiger Day today. And I have an interesting news to share with all of you. Just today, a friend from the Karnataka Forest Department sent me a news article saying that a tiger called T31 was photographed in Kali Tiger Reserve, which is called the Dandeli Anshi Tiger Reserve. And that tiger was last photographed in Chandoli National Park of the Sayadri Tiger Reserve in 2018. So this particular male individual has moved almost 235 kilometers from Chandoli National Park and was photographed a few months ago in Kali Tiger Reserve. So 235 kilometers were moved by this single male individual from Chandoli to Kali. So that's excellent news to get uh, on Global Tiger Day, and it just tells us that these corridors are so important to protect. So I'll give you all a brief chat about corridors and the importance of corridors for large ranging species, especially tigers. So let's start with the first topic, which is why are these corridors important for wide ranging species? So as we all know, corridors are really important for wide ranging species simply because they have large habitat and prey requirements. So if you look at the average body size of a tiger, a male tiger weighs anywhere from 250 to 300 kilos. A female tigress would weigh probably slightly lower, about 150 to 200 kilos. So if you have such a large sized carnivore, you need that carnivore to move around quite a bit for its diet requirements, for its prey requirements. And oftentimes, what happens is when a protected area gets saturated with tigers, these tigers need to move. And of course, they cannot move if there are no structural corridors in place. What happens when you don't have corridors is you have conflict. A lot of conflict happens in fragmented habitats because large animals like tigers cannot move around freely. The minute they get out, they meet agricultural land, they meet villagers, and then is when conflict starts. So, if we want to reduce conflict, one of the first things that management should focus on is to keep these corridors intact. Without corridors, you're going to have increasing amounts of conflict between humans and wild animals. So that's a very important reason why corridors should be kept. The talk was supposed to be between Sheetal and me, but unfortunately there were some glitches, so we couldn't go live together. But I'll briefly talk about why GIS and remote sensing is so important to understand about tiger connectivity and how, as spatial analysts or wildlife biologists and conservationists, we use GIS in our work. So I'll just go to my presentation where I'll explain a little about GIS and remote sensing to you all. So I'll talk briefly about landscape pattern over here. If you look at this figure that I'm showing you, I've shown a very complex forest, and the forest is supposed to have a number of stories. This is the tall emergent trees. It's a dense canopy below that. Then you have shorter trees, then you have shrubs, and then you have herbs. So if you look at a forest is a very, very complex landscape, you know. And if you look at a forest or any landscape from the top, you try to get a different perspective of things. So for example, this is a satellite image of an agricultural area, and it shows some towns and villages over here. So the minute you start looking at any landscape from the top, you can understand things in a very different perspective. So basically, why do we use GIS and remote sensing? We want to convert a simple forest to a complex forest to a simple feature. Of course, the forest is really complex, as we can see in the figure on the left. But the minute you look at it aerially, you can use spatially available tools to make something simpler. So for example, if you see some of these figures that I have shown here, these colorful figures, this is what is called as an NDVI map. Basically, it's a vegetation map done in a GIS or a remote sensing platform. Now this is an image of a forest from the top, and this is an image of a plantation and a forest. So when you have such a complex land use type and you want to map it out, you need tools that can make it simpler for you to do this sort of analysis. So basically what a lot of spatial analysts and conservation biologists do is that we classify images. So what I showed you before was an actual aerial picture of the forest. You could have also seen a satellite image similarly. But now what you are seeing is a simplified version of the forest, which is a raster map in front of you. A raster is basically a classified image where you can then say whether a particular area is forest, whether it's farmland, whether it's river. So you can actually classify the features on a map. So why do we use GIS and remote sensing to understand about corridors and about wildlife? GIS and remote sensing is very useful for us to actually tell us things about point patterns. So if you look at the figure I'm showing you, it could just be a simple point pattern with GIS. For example, the evergreen block that you see, those individual green dots are those trees. And if you compare it to a deciduous forest, you will find that the individual green dots are far lesser. So basically using GIS, you can do simple quantification stuff like how many trees are there in an evergreen forest as compared to how many trees are there in a deciduous forest. So this is one simple application of GIS and remote sensing. The second thing you can do is look at network patterns. So simple analytical tools such as understanding how animals move from one patch to the next, how patches are connected, which are called nodes in GIS terminology, are connected through corridors, or those can be also called as segments. GIS also helps us get surface patterns, so you can actually have digital elevation models like you see on the left. And a lot of us conservation biologists also use this to understand spatial density patterns. For example, this is the spatial density pattern or map of leopards in the Radhanagari Wildlife Sanctuary. And of course, we can also have surface models in terms of occupancy. So this is a map of tigers, dholes, sloth bear, and leopards from the northern Western Ghats. So you can see that there are some areas that are red and that there are some areas that are lightly colored. So it's actually trying to show us which areas are where occupancy or distribution of the animal is higher as opposed to the other parts. This is something I did for herbivores in the Western Ghats as well. So it's trying to show 3 different species and in which part of the landscape the density of these species is higher as compared to other parts. So as you can see, GIS and remote sensing tools are very useful for us to come up with these pretty maps and spatial distribution surfaces, which are very useful for management, in fact. So they have very practical value associated with them. But of course, most importantly, what remote sensing and GIS helps us do is it helps us with categorical patterns. So what is a categorical pattern? I'll explain it to you. Suppose this is a landscape and this is a raster map of the landscape. So basically what I've done is I've divided the landscape into smaller cells. What a GIS analysis or a GIS tool will help me do is it will help me understand. Basically, it will run a function of this sort and then it will tell me, okay, this area when I calculated it, it was 100% forest. So it tells me that the composition of the left block is 100% forest. Now let's look at the right block. Again, when I run a fancy GIS analysis on this block, my GIS tool tells me that the composition of this area is 94% forest, 4% is agriculture, and 2% is village land. So basically what this GIS tool helps us do is it helps us understand what the composition of the landscape is and what the spatial configuration of the landscape is. These are very important for conservation practitioners and spatial analysts because it's on the basis of this information that we actually intervene in terms of our conservation actions and decisions. And of course, WCT has been using this in its work since a long time. This was a recent paper published in 2018 in collaboration with NCBS and Ferrell and University of Montana, where tiger connectivity was examined and future scenarios were examined for tigers to examine, to understand how to minimize extinction into the next century. Those of you who are interested can actually go online and read this paper. So I'll come back to myself here and I will briefly talk to you about how many of these things align with our work. So in fact, in the year 2018, the Ministry of Environment and Forests came up with a public document where they identified 32 tiger corridors in India. This was done by the Ministry of Environment and Forests and Climate Change as well as the National Tiger Conservation Authority. So how were these corridors identified? So these were largely identified using spatial modeling tools. So WCT also uses many spatial modeling tools for corridor identification. One of them is called CircuitScape, where we actually have the landscape as a conductance surface. So basically you have a landscape and then you have protected areas as nodes. And then like you would use theories of physics, from one node to the next you would pass a current. And based on the landscape features, the current will actually tell you what are the best patches of corridors which need to be conserved. So this is basically the gist of the kind of tools that many of us as conservation practitioners use very often. And I showed you some of the maps that I have used for my work. So GIS and remote sensing is a key link to doing any of these spatial analysis. In fact, in today's age, we're just becoming more and more advanced. So even though we are trying to simplify complex things, over time, we are making these simple things a lot more complex, just so that we can capture all the variation that nature possesses. Nature is it's a complex system. So humans will always try to simplify it. But eventually what we want to do is try and garner as much complexity into our model so that we can appreciate each and every aspect, each and every feature that is there in the corridors, in the habitats for animal and species requirements. So here was my short talk about corridors and the use of GIS and remote sensing. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I do hope some of you will be interested enough to read some of the articles we have published and go online and understand and study more about GIS and remote sensing to use in your own conservation work as well. So thank you everybody, it was fantastic being here, and I had a good time talking. Goodbye, have fun, and wish you all a happy Global Tiger Day.